So today's talk is about the rather grisly matter of execution in Rome. Near the Roman Forum, there is a small building which is advertised a bit, not that much visited. It's called the Mamertine Prison. When you go inside, as you descend into the levels where prisoners were kept, there's a large inscription, and that lists a number of people who were kept there prior to being executed. So there's a list of who was there, when they were there, and how they were executed. Some it lists as being crucified, some it lists as being strangled, and some it lists as being beheaded. When you look at that, it makes you think, why was there a different method? What was different about these people? Why were they killed in a different way? Executions in Rome varied according to what you'd done, what social class you were, and what legal status you had. Now, the methods of execution were not unique to Rome. Many of them the Romans borrowed from other cultures, as they did many other things. So they're not really Roman methods of execution, although the Romans became quite good and efficient at using them. So we're going to have a think now about some of these methods of execution. First of all, military execution. Now, the Romans had an imaginative solution here. If they thought that a unit in the army had not fought hard enough, or had shown some sort of disrespect, then that unit was sentenced to be decimated. This meant that every 10th man was beaten to death by the previous 9. This was to encourage a sense of mutual support and to make sure that people were so frightened of being thought cowardly that they would fight no matter what. It's a little similar to how some troops were treated in the First World War, I guess. Some criminals were sentenced to death ad metalla, which means sentenced to death in the mines. Now, this was a cruel and harsh punishment. It was economically quite useful to the Romans. It meant that you'd got slave labor to mine things, but it was a very grim punishment altogether because you would just be worked to death in the mines. Once sentenced there, you would very likely not see the light of day again. We know that a number of people were sentenced to death in the mines, in iron mines and so on in Britain, the mines all over the empire. The same was true. Sometimes people were sentenced to death ad bestias, which meant being sentenced to death in the arena. Now, we heard a little about that with the death of Polycarp. So sometimes it was as public entertainment, and sometimes people who were sentenced to death in this way were sent out to fight in the middle part of the day, the least popular part of the day, it has to be said, as the meridiani, the midday fighters. And they were sent out to fight against heavily armed gladiators with nothing to defend them at all. So it was just being savaged to death by trained professionals. Then there was beheading. Now, beheading, a swift death, you'd hope, was the preserve, more or less, of citizens and higher status people. We know of one very high status person, a Roman citizen of some distinction. He was called Saul when he was born, and later St. Paul. He was arrested around the time of the Great Fire, at the same time as St. Peter. Both he and Peter were executed, but by different means. St. Paul was a Roman citizen. As we know, he boasted once and claimed immunity from being flogged when he was arrested by a Roman governor earlier in his preaching career. But when he was sentenced to death, he was beheaded, and he was beheaded on the site of one of the 4 basilicas of Rome, San Paolo fuori la Mura, just outside the city, on the south edge of the city. It's a very beautiful rebuilt basilica there. Then there was crucifixion, probably the most famous method of Roman execution, mostly because of 2 people. One was Spartacus and the other was Jesus Christ. Spartacus and his followers, who'd rebelled against the Roman state, a slave revolt in the 70s BC, they were executed for miles and miles along the side of the Appian Way on the way out of Rome. The reason for that was they were slaves. You could do what you like with those. They didn't really count as people, and executing them in such a way meant that every other slave got the message, don't be a rebel because this could happen to you. Jesus was crucified, as were St. Peter and St. Andrew. A little about St. Andrew. He was crucified in an unusual cruciform way. The X on the Saltire Cross of Scotland, the Cross of St. Andrew, reflects the way that he was stretched out to be nailed to the cross. St. Peter, the earliest tradition is that he was crucified upside down on the site of the Vatican Hill, where St. Peter's Basilica now is, and he was buried there. He said, the story is that he said he felt unworthy to be executed in the manner of Jesus, and so the Romans said, we can fix that, and so crucified him upside down. And all the earliest traditions suggest that that was how that was. So if you see an upside down crucifixion, the likelihood is that's St. Peter. And then there was Jesus. Now, we know quite a bit about the detail of how Christ was crucified because there's accounts of it in the gospel. So I'm going to read you in a minute John's account of that, or some bits of that. But here's some basics of it. First off, you were likely to be flogged, as Polycarp had been in the talk about that. You could possibly be beaten, and you'd be forced to carry your cross to the place of execution. We know that happened to Jesus because he collapsed under the weight of it, and it was taken over by someone else. It's very likely that you were nailed through the wrists rather than through the hands, because through the hands wouldn't support your body weight because your sinews and your skin would rip. So it's likely that those things about stigmata through the hands might be based on a misunderstanding of Roman crucifixion. Either way, your legs would be tied together to the cross, or possibly nailed through at the ankles. How did you die? Possibly through shock, possibly through heart attack, possibly through exhaustion, possibly because you would be asphyxiated as your internal organs, especially your lungs, collapsed. Your death could be hastened by your legs being broken, and this is what happened to Jesus on the cross. Although it sounds particularly brutal, it may actually have spared you a number of hours of agony because it was likely to make you die quicker. So here's St. John's account. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished and so that scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I'm thirsty. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put it on a hyssop sponge and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, it is finished. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. And after that, it tells us that his body was taken down from the cross. His legs were not broken because he was already dead. And that's how that crucifixion finished. So why did the Romans spend so much time and effort crucifying people? Why did they spend so much time finding imaginative and different ways to execute people? After all, the outcome's the same in the end. Somebody ends up dead. Well, I don't have answers for all of these things, but some of it is to do with imposing the maximum amount of fear and terror on those witnesses to it and those who were told about it. Why inflict suffering in the way that they did? Well, perhaps to inflict fear and terror also, perhaps with a feeling of vengeance and paying somebody back for what they felt had been done to people. To impose fear and terror, that was certainly the case for Spartacus and his followers. Why do that to Jesus and to Peter and Andrew? Certainly to impose fear and terror too. Did it have that effect? Probably not, because as we know from the witnessing of Polycarp and other martyrs later, people continued to believe, and the message of Christianity continued to spread.